Today, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about my story, the book that I'm writing and working on. I call it An Empire of Silk and Bone, the name of the web serial, with the book one title being Return of the Broken Crown. Now, the question that I always ask myself when I think about my story is what is your story trying to do? Every author has their own goals, their own purposes, their own intentionality when they write. You don't simply write a 1,000-page fantasy story without that kind of intentionality. And so, for me today, I would like to describe what I think makes my series special. And first and foremost, I think that a lot of it comes down to the depth of world building and intricacy that I'm working on. My favorite fantasy stories, when I take a second to go back and think through what I truly love, it's deep complexity. It's world building that raises questions that I have to grapple with or think about or that make me go, wow, that was cool. I love watching characters grow and progress and discover new things about themselves, about the magic, and about the world that they are a part of. And I think that the best fantasy derives at least some or the majority of its plot from the characters growing and developing into their own powers. I think you see that in classical fantasy. If you're looking at the Wheel of Time, there's no way that the characters at the end of that story are going to fail to beat the characters at the start of the story in a fight, in a contest of knowledge, in a contest of wills, in any area, really, right? If that was the case, then what was the point of the 14-book story? When I think of the counter argument there, the stories that don't have this massive character growth component in terms of power or skill, oftentimes that's not the intention of the story. When I think about Malazan as a series, 10 deeply complex books with complex world building, a huge cast of characters, it's true that no single character is stronger at the end of the series necessarily than they would be when they were first introduced. But that's not the story that Malazan is trying to tell. Malazan is telling of the conflict of empires, of the conflict of gods, of clashes of epic proportion. And so it lacks the character progression, but it certainly doesn't lack a progression in terms of plot or the reader's understanding of the world. I read all 10 books of Malazan in 2024. That was my goal last year. And I still find myself thinking back to the themes and the challenges and the plot lines that Erikson puts forth. I think about book 5, Midnight Tides, and how Erikson takes, in the 5th book of a series of all things, an entirely new cast of characters and makes you grow to enjoy them. Tehal Benedict is a wonderful character. Bug, his manservant, is one of a kind. And as I go through and I reread Malazan books, I notice that even if the story didn't progress, I, as a reader, did throughout that process. I know more. I understand more, and I take more away from the story now that I've read it once. Not all stories are like that. So when I think about my story, An Empire of Silk and Bone, that's kind of the realm that I'm working to write within. To have not quite the complexity and depth of Malazan. I like my readers more than I think Erikson likes his at times. But I also want to ensure that despite the more complicated world building, my story still has that progression element. The characters growing and discovering new powers and abilities. The plot isn't the only thing growing in my story. I want it to be the characters. I want it to be their emotional development. I want it to be the reader as well. As I go through and I write about emotions and right and wrong and morality and ethics, I want my story to challenge the reader to think about or approach the world in new ways. I think that's really where philosophy comes into play. I have a background in philosophical ethics. It's something that I really enjoy. Ethical dilemmas and problems and ethical reasoning is just fascinating. And I think that has to come out in my story. The stories that we tell are a reflection of the lives that we live and the things that interest us. And I love ethics. In my setting, I have an entire section, the Justicars, that are modeled after Rawlsian Veil of Ignorance principles, but extrapolate out into a magic setting. Even my primary magic system of the Empire, the Sul Empire, is modeled based on social contract theories applied to include magical development. Philosophy, social contract philosophy specifically, is at the core of what I am trying to do with my story. I don't know if that is what everyone's favorite takeaway will be. I'm not sure how many readers are looking for that kind of philosophy in their world, but I know that some people are. I know that I always am. If I can grapple with a fantasy story that feels epic and interesting, has monsters and heroes that slay them, but at the same times, I end up thinking about what I personally enjoy, it ends up being the philosophical inquiries that make me grapple or interact with the story in a deeper, more complex way. So that's kind of the broad shoot of what I'm going for. In terms of characters, my plot follows specifically 3 youths, recently turned 20, who are going out on their first adventure as they're welcomed into the contract of the Empire and they have signed their souls into being citizens of this empire itself. I have Hadrian, a child of Kutra, a village out in the far west portion of the Empire beyond the borders, actively trying to expand the borders. Hadrian's whole plot and journey is kind of modeled, at least as a premise, off of the settler programs, both in the current day with nations that actively try to settle lands that aren't their own, not with violence necessarily, but peacefully, just kind of taking over the land that wasn't being used by others and then claiming it as theirs. It's a famous tactic that the United States applied back when we were seizing the southern border from Mexico before the Mexican-American War. That's kind of Hadrian's driving goal, though, is to expand the empire. The only problem is that the faction that they're trying to expand into is an ally of the empire he's a part of, and his actions could lead to a broader war. Silvestranath is the second character in their little group, and she comes from the sect of Silken Grace, and she is one of the Silkborn, a race species that is woven by this group called the Weavers to be perfect. Her whole body is formed of silk, and she operates with an intuitive understanding of things that is not natural for humans. Her parents both had to give up themselves, weaving parts of their own soul together to form her. Every generation of Silkborn takes 2 of their talents and it reduces it to 1 new opportunity. Silva is trying to live up to that legacy. Lodum Jarval is the third character, and Lodum had his brother, someone that he no longer has memory of, killed in a battle with the Tool, the ancient monstrous enemy of the Sul Empire. These are ogres whose very ability to eat someone can consume their memory, their meaning, their impact from the world, and take it away. Lodum's brother was eaten by the Toll, and so Lodum does not remember his brother at all. That lack, that wound, drives him to vengeance, and he has decided that he will be the one that destroys the Toll, that ends their threat. Now, not all powers within the Empire want to go to war, even against the monsters at the gate. It is costly, it is dangerous, and it will distract or pull away from the main priorities of those factions of the Empire. Lodum just doesn't care. And so we have this trio that are seeking the heights of power, all for their own purpose, and all of which are struggling to interact with each other as they're coming to terms with the fact that they are entering into a new chapter of their lives. Guiding them are 3 mentors, Casselia the Crownless, Al-Sorana the Harbinger, and Krinka the Archivist. These 3 mentors are set up as not quite foils to the main character, but as individuals who have lived for 1,000 years, 1,000 plus years, as venerant of the Sul Empire, the immortal champions and teachers who are tasked with training the next generation. They are looking to make heroes out of these recently ascended children. And that's kind of where the story takes off. I'm still finishing book 1 right now, But I believe that an Empire of Silk and Bone will fill a great niche for those that like the complex world building, but also enjoy more of the progression fantasy elements. If you want your characters to rapidly be advancing, learning new magics, and growing and improving, this is a story that will feature that, but within a framework and a backdrop that's more complex. At the end of the day, I want an Empire of Silk and Bone to feel, in terms of depth, a lot like The Wandering Inn does. The Wandering Inn's my favorite story. It spans, I don't even know how many million words at this point, so many books that it's beyond counting. But if you're caught up with The Wandering Inn, you know that that length comes with benefits all its own. Traditional stories don't reach the tens of millions of words. The Wandering Inn is unique in that. And it's unique because the author releases large chapters week after week after week. It shows the benefits of the web serial approach versus classical publishing. Novels are, by their very nature, constrained to a set amount of words. They have to be publishable in a book, and that book has to be long enough to get the story across, but not so long as to lose readers. The Wandering Inn says, I don't care if the length loses readers. That's not the point. In exchange, Pirate Abba, the author, can write long chapter after long chapter, week after week, month after month, year after year, and it turns out that when you write 10 to 30,000 words a week, you get significantly better at writing. The best way to grow is to do. And that is exactly what Pirate Abba does. It's what I think a lot of the best web serial authors do. If you read something like A Practical Guide to Evil, one of my favorite web serials, not popular enough in my eyes, it starts off weaker, but as the author keeps writing, as they get further into their own writing journey, the story improves as well. It is an ongoing process of improvement and refinement of the story growing along with the writer. And as a reader, it is quite fun to read and feel like the story only ever goes upwards. I don't know how many classically published trilogies I've read where book 1 is excellent and book 2 is a slog and book 3 is fine, or some variation there too. It's rare that all 3 books in a trilogy are excellent. Web serials say, we don't know which of our books will be excellent, but the ones at the start will end up being worse than the ones at the end by the sheer nature of the growth of our talents. That is what I want to see from an Empire of Silk and Bone. To be able to look back 3 years, 5 years from now at my early writing and say, not as good as it could have been. But that means that it is better now. It means that I have improved. So, in short, I am excited about my story. I'm excited about the tale I'm telling. I'm excited about the characters that I have. I think that readers will absolutely love Al Sorana, the Harbinger, Naga that is dark and humorous, but also kind of scary. He's the Harbinger of extinction, known for exterminating entire species. Yet, he should come across as lovable and interesting and funny, because the best characters in a complex world are complex on their own. There is no pure good and evil. Not really. There's shades from white to pitch black, and most of what's in the middle there is gray. That's what I hope my story brings out. And if you do decide to read An Empire of Silk and Bone, or just A Return of the Broken Crown, I hope you enjoy it. I hope that you give me feedback. I hope you tell me what you love. And I hope at the end of the day that you come away feeling like you've been challenged to think about the world differently than you started. That, after all, is what